Have you ever found something in the woods that doesn't belong there? My name is Cassidy Porter. I'm a wilderness custodian for Parks Canada, stationed in the Cariboo region of central British Columbia. For the past 6 years, I've worked on a posting that most people don't know exists. My official title is Heritage Structure Monitor. My actual job is more specific. I document, maintain, and most importantly, monitor a particular type of structure that appears throughout the backcountry forests of this region. Structures we don't talk about in public reports. Structures that aren't on any official maps or visitor guides. Structures that look exactly like outdoor staircases leading nowhere. Freestanding wooden or stone steps that rise 8 to 12 feet into empty air, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Most people would call them abandoned construction projects. The old homestead remains. Forgotten logging infrastructure. But I know what they really are. What they've always been. And why my job exists to make sure people stay away from them. If you stay until the end, I'll tell you about the protocol. Not the official Parks Canada safety guidelines, though those matter. The other protocol, the one that governs how we interact with the staircases, the rules that have been passed down through 3 generations of custodians who've worked this territory, the rules that explain why these structures are never removed despite being hazards, why each one is documented with precise GPS coordinates that are classified above standard park ranger access. Why did my predecessor spend 19 years walking the same routes, checking the same staircases, and never once violated the primary directive that keeps custodians alive? Because in the Cariboo forests, these staircases aren't abandoned infrastructure. They're something much older. Something that predates European settlement. Something that Indigenous knowledge holders warned about long before Parks Canada existed. And something that has rules that matter more than any official safety protocol. Rules about what you document, what you touch, how close you stand, and most critically, which step you never ever place your foot on. The third step. Always the third step. And if you want to understand why, you'll need to know what happens to people who ignore that rule. What I've seen in 6 years of monitoring 23 staircases scattered across 2,000 square kilometers of wilderness. What the notebook I inherited explains in careful clinical detail. And what I learned the hard way when I made a mistake that should have cost me everything. I grew up in Prince George, 3 hours north of my current posting. My father was a forestry contractor. My mother worked for the provincial government in land management. I spent my childhood in the bush, learning to read terrain, to navigate by landmarks and compass, to understand that forests operate on their own logic, and our job is to pay attention and adapt. After studying environmental science and heritage conservation, I wanted work that combined both. Remote work, real responsibility, not desk analysis or urban park management. I wanted to be in actual wilderness, doing work that mattered in ways that weren't just bureaucratic box checking. When I saw the posting for Heritage Structure Monitor in the Cariboo region, it seemed perfect. Remote, specialized, poorly defined in ways that suggested interesting work. I applied. Got interviewed by a woman named Sharon Mackenzie who'd held the position for 19 years. She was careful, asked strange questions, wanted to know if I believed in respecting Indigenous knowledge even when it conflicted with scientific understanding, if I could keep information confidential, if I was comfortable with ambiguity and protocols I might not fully understand. I said yes to everything. I wanted the job. Sharon spent 6 weeks training me before she retired. Standard wilderness skills, navigation, emergency protocols, radio procedure, but also other things. She showed me the official database of heritage structures in the region, old cabins, trap lines, mining claims, historical markers. Then she showed me a different database, smaller, restricted access, containing only 23 entries. Each entry had GPS coordinates, photographs, and a single word classification: staircase. She pulled up images, and I saw them for the first time. Freestanding staircases in the middle of forests. Some were wood, old weathered lumber. Others were stone, carefully stacked rocks forming steps. All of them rose about 8 to 12 feet. All of them led to nothing, just stopped in midair, surrounded by trees and undergrowth with no buildings, no foundations, no context for why they existed. "These are your primary responsibilities," Sharon said. "Everything else in your job description is covered. Your real work is monitoring these, making sure they're undisturbed, making sure people don't interact with them, and most importantly, making sure you follow the protocol when you do your inspections." "What are they?" I asked. "Old homesteads? Logging infrastructure?" Sharon was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Nobody knows exactly what they are, but we know what they do, and we know they're old, much older than European settlement. The Tsilhatin people have stories about them going back generations. They call them different things depending on family and location, but the understanding is consistent. They're thresholds, passages, things that connect places that shouldn't be connected, and they have rules. Rules about how you interact with them. Rules that matter more than any Parks Canada protocol, because violating them has consequences that can't be fixed by helicopter rescue or medical evacuation." She pulled out a different notebook. "Not official. Personal. Worn. This has been maintained by every custodian since the position was created in 1978. It contains observations, incidents, the protocol. You'll add your own entries, and when you eventually train your replacement, you'll pass it to them, just as it's been passed to me, just as I'm now passing it to you, because this job isn't about heritage conservation. It's about containment, about making sure these staircases stay isolated, about making sure people who stumble across them don't do what comes naturally, don't climb them, or more specifically, don't climb past a certain point." "Which point?" "The third step," Sharon said. "Never the third step. That's the primary rule. Everything else in the protocol supports that rule. But that's the one that matters most. The one that's been tested too many times. The one that has consequences we've documented but can't explain. People who climb to the third step don't come back the same, or don't come back at all. And before you ask, no, we don't know why. We just know it's true. Has been true for as long as anyone's been monitoring these structures, and will remain true whether we understand it or not." She handed me the notebook. "Read this. Memorize the protocol. Then decide if you still want this job. Because once you start, once you've seen what I'm about to show you, you can't unsee it. I can't unknow it. You'll be responsible for these staircases, for keeping people away from them, for checking them regularly, for following rules that will seem arbitrary until you see what happens when they're broken, and for living with knowledge that you can never fully share. Knowledge that will isolate you from other rangers, from friends, from anyone who hasn't done this work. Because how do you explain that your job is babysitting staircases that shouldn't exist? That leads nowhere but somehow goes somewhere anyway. That is a step you must never touch, because doing so opens something that was meant to stay closed." I read the notebook that night, cover to cover. Entries dating back to 1978. 3 custodians before Sharon, all describing the same things. The 23 staircases scattered through the Cariboo backcountry, their locations, their conditions, and incidents, people who'd climbed them, what happened, how quickly, how permanently, and the protocol that had developed through trial and terrible error, through custodians learning what worked and what didn't, through indigenous knowledge holders sharing what their ancestors had known, through decades of people trying to understand something that resisted understanding but demanded respect. I took the job. I spent my first year learning the routes, visiting each staircase monthly, documenting their condition, checking for signs of human interaction, following the protocol exactly as Sharon had taught me, and slowly understanding that these weren't just mysterious structures. They were active, functional, doing something I couldn't see but could feel, something that made the air around them taste different, made compasses act strangely within 10 meters, made wildlife avoid them, made the forest seem quieter, more watchful, more aware in their immediate vicinity. They weren't abandoned. They were operating, had always been operating, and my job wasn't preservation. It was making sure nobody interfered with whatever they were doing, making sure the threshold stayed closed, making sure the third step remained untouched, because something waited there, something old, something patient, something that had been held back by rules and respect and the simple act of not climbing higher than you should. And I was about to learn exactly what that something was, because in my second year I made a mistake. A small mistake, a violation of protocol that should have been survivable. And I discovered that the staircases weren't just structures. They were warnings. They were barriers. And they were also invitations to anyone foolish enough to accept what the third step offered. The first anomaly came in April of my second year. I was conducting a routine inspection of Staircase 11, located about 40 kilometers northeast of my base station in Williams Lake. The route required 2 days of hiking through dense lodgepole pine forest, following game trails and old trap lines that hadn't seen regular human traffic in decades. Staircase 11 was one of the wooden ones. 8 steps. Weathered gray lumber that looked a century old but never seemed to rot or decay despite constant exposure. It stood in a small clearing, maybe 30 meters across, where nothing else grew except moss and low ferns. The trees formed a perfect circle around it. Not natural. Too precise. Like something had drawn a boundary that the forest respected. I arrived late in the afternoon. Set up camp 50 meters away. Protocol specified minimum 40 meters from any staircase. Never camp in visual range. Never sleep where you can see them. The reasoning wasn't explained in the notebook, but the rule was absolute. I made dinner, checked my equipment, then approached the staircase as the sun began to set. The protocol required inspections at dusk or dawn. Never full daylight. Never darkness. The transitional times. When the light changed. When the forest shifted between states. The staircase looked exactly as it had during my last inspection 3 weeks prior. 8 steps rising to nothing. No railings. No visible foundation, though the structure was perfectly stable. I walked the perimeter, checked for new footprints, disturbed ground, signs of human presence. Nothing. Then I began the physical inspection. Step 1. Visual examination from 3 meters. Check for structural damage, discoloration, new markings. Step 2. Approach 1 meter. Check for scent changes, temperature variations, any sensory irregularities. Step 3. Touch the first step only. Briefly. Confirming material condition. Step 4. Photograph from multiple angles. Step 5. Retreat. Record observations. Leave. I was on step 3, literally touching the first wooden step when I felt it. A vibration. Subtle. Like a low-frequency hum conducted through the wood into my fingertips. I pulled back immediately. The protocol said if you feel anything unusual, retreat and report. But I paused. Sharon had never mentioned vibrations. I checked the notebook entry for Staircase 11. Nothing about vibrations in previous inspections. This was new. I documented it. Note the time, 1847. Temperature, 12 degrees Celsius. Weather clear. Then I followed protocol and retreated to camp. But I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that vibration, what it meant, what had changed, whether I should hike back to report it immediately or wait for my scheduled check-in 3 days later. The notebook said to document and continue unless there's immediate danger. I decided to continue. The next morning I returned at dawn, 5:53 a.m., repeated the inspection protocol, approached, checked, and when I touched the first step, the vibration was stronger, definite, pulsing slightly, like a heartbeat conducted through wood. And something else. The air around the staircase felt thicker, harder to breathe. Not dangerously so, but noticeably, like the atmospheric pressure had changed. My compass, which normally went erratic within 10 meters, was spinning wildly even at 3 meters distance. More erratic than usual. I took photos, documented everything. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I touched the second step. Protocol said first step only. Never hire without explicit authorization from your supervisor. And my supervisor was Sharon, who'd retired. I was the supervisor now, but the protocol existed for reasons. Reasons I was supposed to respect even without understanding them. Still I touched it. Just briefly. 2 fingers on the second step. The vibration was much stronger, almost painful, and the air pressure sensation intensified. I felt dizzy, pulled back, and as I retreated I heard it. A sound from above the staircase, from the empty air where the steps led. A sound like wind but not wind, like voices but not quite voices. Distant, muffled, as if something on the other side of a barrier was trying to speak through it, trying to reach through. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped, and the forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence so complete it felt like pressure. I left. Didn't run, but walked quickly back to camp. Packed immediately. Hiked out the same day instead of continuing my route. Got back to the base station and radioed my check-in early. Reported the anomaly exactly as I'd observed it. Vibrations, pressure, sound, and my protocol violation touching the second step. The radio operator told me someone would contact me. 3 days later, a Parks Canada vehicle arrived. But it wasn't a ranger. It was Dr. Helena Voss, a researcher I'd never met, whose job title was listed as Cultural Heritage Specialist, but who actually worked for a department that didn't appear on organizational charts. She read my report, asked detailed questions, then pulled out a laptop and showed me something. "This is Staircase 11's activity log," she said. "We monitor them remotely. Seismic sensors, electromagnetic readings, atmospheric pressure. We've been doing this since 2003. Look at this." She showed me a graph. It spiked dramatically starting the day before my inspection. The staircase activated. We don't know why. Could be seasonal. Could be a lunar cycle. Could be completely random. But when they activate, the protocol becomes even more critical. Because an active staircase is trying to do what it was built to do. It's trying to open. And the only thing keeping it closed is people like you following rules that prevent the opening mechanism from completing. "What's the opening mechanism?" I asked. "The third step," Helena said. "That's the threshold. The first step is fine, it's just foundation. The second step is warning, you start feeling the activation. But the third step is crossing, is opening, is accepting the invitation. And once someone steps on the third step of an active staircase, things happen that we can't predict or control. Things that suggest these staircases connect our location to somewhere else. And whatever is on the other side has been waiting a very long time for someone to open the door from this side. Helena spent 2 days with me reviewing the complete protocol. Not just the field inspection procedures but the theoretical framework as much as anyone understood it for why the rules existed. She pulled out files, incident reports dating back decades, some from before the custodian program existed, reports from indigenous communities, from trappers, from the handful of researchers who'd studied the staircases over the years, and from the people who'd violated the primary rule, who'd climbed to the 3rd step or higher. The protocol had 9 primary rules. Rule 1. Never approach a staircase alone. This one had been violated frequently in the early years before the custodian program formalized. Solo hikers, researchers, trappers checking their lines, all of them found the staircases by accident. Some climbed them. Those who climbed alone and survived universally reported the same thing: the sensation of being watched, of something aware of them, something that recognized their isolation and vulnerability. Groups seemed to deter this attention, or at least dilute it. Rule 2. Conduct inspections only at dawn or dusk, the transition times, when the staircases were most visible but least active. Midday inspections resulted in equipment failure, cameras malfunctioning, compasses failing, people experiencing disorientation. Night inspections were forbidden entirely after a 1983 incident where a custodian approached staircase 7 at midnight and returned to base camp 12 hours later with no memory of the intervening time and symptoms consistent with severe hypothermia despite it being July. Rule 3. Maintain a minimum 40 meters distance for camps. Closer camping resulted in disturbed sleep, nightmares with consistent themes: climbing, ascending, reaching for something above, people waking to find themselves walking toward the staircase unconsciously. One custodian in 1991 had to be physically restrained by his partner after attempting to approach staircase 15 at 3 a.m. while still asleep. Rule 4. Never climb past the 2nd step. The primary rule, the one with the most documentation. 27 recorded violations since 1978. Outcomes varied, but none were positive. Some people simply disappeared, stepped onto the 3rd step and were gone. No trace. Nobody. Nothing. Others returned changed. Couldn't explain where they'd been. Spoke of forests that weren't forests. Of structures that weren't structures. Of something vast and patient waiting at the top of stairs that went much higher than 8 steps. Something that wanted very much to come down, and was waiting for permission, for an invitation, for someone to open the threshold from this side. Rule 5. Document all changes immediately. The staircases weren't static. They aged, changed. Sometimes new stairs appeared. Sometimes materials shifted. Wood to stone, stone to wood. These changes correlated with activation events, with periods where the barriers thinned, where the connection between here and there grew stronger. Undocumented changes meant custodians wouldn't know when activation patterns shifted, wouldn't know when danger increased. Rule 6. Never touch the stairs with bare skin during activation. Gloves required. Barrier between flesh and material. Why? Because during activation, the staircases conducted something. The people who'd touched active staircases with bare hands reported sensations, visions, glimpses of the other side, and afterward obsession, compulsion to return, to climb, to reach the 3rd step. 3 former custodians had to be removed from duty because of this. Couldn't be trusted near the staircases anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about climbing. Rule 7. If you hear voices or sounds from above, retreat immediately. This meant the activation had reached a critical threshold. meant something on the other side was actively trying to communicate, to call, to lure. Every person who'd heard the voices and ignored them, who'd stayed and listened, had eventually climbed, eventually violated Rule 4, eventually disappeared or returned broken. Rule 8. Report all wildlife behavior anomalies. Animals avoided the staircases, wouldn't cross the clearings, wouldn't nest nearby. But during activation events, this changed. Birds would circle, deer would approach, bears would investigate, as if the normal repulsion had inverted, as if during activation the staircases called to more than just humans. And when wildlife started approaching, it meant the threshold was very thin, meant danger. Rule 9. Never bring artifacts away from the sites. Some people had found objects near the staircases, strange objects, tools that didn't match any known design, stones carved with symbols, pieces of material that analysis couldn't identify. Taking these objects resulted in problems, equipment failures, accidents. The objects seemed to carry the activation with them, to spread the effect. All artifacts had to remain on site. I had to stay in the clearings, had to stay with the staircases they belonged to. Helena explained that these rules weren't theoretical. They'd been developed through consequence, through people learning the hard way what worked and what didn't. The Tsilhatin have protocols that predate ours by centuries, she said. Their rules are more extensive, more specific. They know these structures as thresholds of the stolen path, places where ancestors tried to create shortcuts, to connect distant places, to bypass normal geography. But the shortcuts went wrong, connected to somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't meant to be connected to here. And now the thresholds are maintained not to use them, but to keep them closed, to keep whatever is on the other side from finding its way through. I spent weeks reviewing the incident reports, learning the patterns, understanding that my job wasn't just documentation, it was containment. I was part of a system that had existed long before Parks Canada, a system of watchers and barriers and protocols designed to manage something that shouldn't exist but did, something that predated modern understanding, something that indigenous knowledge had developed strategies for, and something that would continue existing long after me. By June, I'd settled into the rhythm. Monthly routes, visiting each staircase, following protocol exactly, documenting obsessively, and slowly, I started noticing things the reports hadn't quite captured. Subtleties. The staircases had patterns beyond just activation events. Some were more active than others. Staircase 7, 3, and 17 showed elevated readings consistently, were harder to approach. It made me more uneasy. Others like 11, 12, and 20 felt almost dormant. Still dangerous, still requiring protocol, but quieter, less actively trying to open. I also noticed the clearings changed. Not the staircases themselves, but the empty circles around them, the boundaries where trees stopped growing. During my first year, I'd assumed these were static, but they weren't. They expanded and contracted. Staircase 7's clearing had grown by almost 3 meters in 8 months. The trees were dying back. Something was pushing them away, creating more space. As if the staircase needed room. I needed to grow. And whatever mechanism maintained the clearings was becoming more aggressive. By my 3rd year, isolation started affecting me differently than I'd expected. Not loneliness, I prepared for that, but a constant awareness that I was managing something beyond my understanding. That every inspection could be the one where something went wrong, where activation reached a critical threshold, where the protocols failed and I had to make decisions nobody had prepared me for. The weight of it accumulated. It made sleeping difficult, made me hypervigilant during inspections, made me see patterns that might not exist. I started having dreams, recurring themes, climbing stairs that went higher than they should, reaching the top and finding not empty air but doorways, openings into forests that looked almost like the Cariboo but were wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Wrong light, wrong sounds, and something waiting, something vast and patient that noticed me, that made me want to keep climbing, to open the door from my side. The dreams weren't subtle, weren't metaphorical. They felt like instructions, like something trying to teach me what to do, trying to show me what waited if I just followed the rules differently, if I just climbed one step higher. I mentioned this during a check-in with Helena. She wasn't surprised. All the custodians experience it, she said. Extended exposure to the staircases creates psychological effects. You're spending time near active thresholds, near something that wants to be opened. That exerts pressure, influence. Dreams are part of that. They'll continue. But as long as you recognize them as external, as influence rather than your own desires, you'll be fine. The ones who get in trouble are the ones who start thinking the dreams are their own ideas, who starts believing they should climb, that they'd be safe, that the rules don't apply to them because they're special, because they understand. What happens if I can't maintain that distinction? I asked. Then you request reassignment, and someone else takes over. We've had 6 custodians in 46 years. 3 retired normally. 2 requested reassignment because of psychological pressure. 1 violated protocol and had to be removed. This isn't a position you can do forever. Eventually, the exposure accumulates. Eventually, everyone reaches a threshold. The key is recognizing when you're approaching yours. I thought about that constantly. About my threshold. About how I'd know when I was too close. When the dream stopped being external pressure and became internal desire. When I stopped following rules because they were protocols and started resenting them because they prevented something I wanted. I watched for that shift, monitored my own psychological state as carefully as I monitored the staircases. In September of my 3rd year, I had my closest call. I was inspecting staircase 3, one of the consistently active ones. Stone construction, perfectly fitted blocks without mortar, rising 12 feet, 8 steps like all of them, but each step was taller, more imposing. Staircase 3 had always made me nervous. The clearing around it was the largest. The silence is the most oppressive. The sense of being watched is the most acute. I was following protocol exactly. Dawn inspection. 40-meter camp distance. Approach from the east per the site-specific procedures. Visual check from 3 meters. Everything appeared normal. But when I moved to 1 meter for the detailed inspection, I noticed something. The 3rd step, the forbidden step, had changed. There was a carving. Fresh. Symbols I didn't recognize. They hadn't been there during my last inspection 4 weeks prior. Someone had been here, had approached close enough to carve. I touched the 3rd step. Protocol said document and report immediately, but I needed to photograph the symbols. I needed to record what they looked like, and the only angle that captured them clearly required me to stand on the 2nd step, just to get high enough, just for a moment. I knew it was a bad idea, knew it violated protocol. But I rationalized. I was wearing gloves. It was just for a photo. Just one shot. I'd done it before, touched the 2nd step. This was barely different. I climbed. 1 step. Then 2. Put my weight on the 2nd step. Raised my camera. And the world changed. The clearing didn't look different. But it felt different. The air became thick. Heavy. Like water. My ears popped from the pressure change. And I felt it. Something massive and aware turning its attention toward me. Not seeing me. Worse than that. recognizing me, acknowledging me, like I'd knocked on a door and something on the other side had heard, had come to check, had pressed itself against the barrier between us to see who was asking for entry. The camera fell from my hands. I heard it hit the ground but couldn't look away from the third step. It was right there, just 6 inches above my current position. I could step up so easily, could just lift my foot, could see what everyone wondered about. What happened on the third step? What opened? What connection completed? And part of me wanted to. I wanted it desperately. I wanted to know. I wanted to understand. I wanted to go wherever the stairs led because suddenly it felt like the most important thing in the world. Like the answer to questions I'd been asking my entire life. But another part of me, the part that had memorized protocols, that had read incident reports, that knew what happened to people who climbed, screamed at me to move, to get down, to retreat. I forced myself to look away from the third step, forced my legs to move, step down to the first step, then to the ground, then backward, 5 meters, 10, 20, and the pressure released. The world snapped back to normal. The compulsion evaporated like it had never existed, and I was left shaking, gasping, realizing how close I'd come to climbing, how powerfully I'd wanted to despite knowing better, despite years of training, despite everything. I retrieved my camera, photographed the symbols from ground level. I packed my equipment, left immediately instead of completing the full inspection, hiked 8 hours straight back to base, radioed Helena the moment I had a signal, and spent the next 3 days debriefing, explaining what I'd felt, how strong the compulsion had been, how much I'd wanted to climb despite knowing the consequences. Helena reviewed my report carefully, then showed me something. "This is the carving," she said, pulling up an image database. "It's appeared before, on 7 other staircases, always during high activation periods. We think they're not carved by people. We think they're manifestations. The threshold trying to open itself, trying to create lures. You felt the compulsion because standing on the second step during an activation event with fresh carvings present creates maximum vulnerability. You were exactly where the threshold needed you to be, 1 step away from completing the opening. If you'd climbed to the third step at that moment, you wouldn't have disappeared. You'd have opened it fully, and whatever is on the other side would have had a clear path through. What do we do now?" I asked. "You're done with staircase 3, Helena said. "We'll assign it to someone else. You'll continue with your other routes. But 3 is off your list, because now it knows you. Now it's established that you're vulnerable to it, and going back would be dangerous, for you and for everyone else. The protocols exist to prevent personal connections between custodians and specific sites. You're supposed to remain anonymous, detached. But you felt something at staircase 3 that went beyond protocol. It recognized you, and that changes everything." I climbed 1 step, then 2, put my weight on the second step, raised my camera, and the world changed. The clearing didn't look different, but it felt different. The air became thick, heavy, like water. My ears popped from the pressure change, and I felt it, something massive and aware turning its attention toward me, not seeing me. Worse than that, recognizing me, acknowledging me, like I'd knocked on a door and something on the other side had heard, had come to check, had pressed itself against the barrier between us to see who was asking for entry. The camera fell from my hands. I heard it hit the ground but couldn't look away from the third step. It was right there, just 6 inches above my current position. I could step up so easily, could just lift my foot, could see what everyone wondered about. What happened on the third step? What opened? What connection completed? And part of me wanted to. I wanted it desperately. I wanted to know. I wanted to understand. I wanted to go wherever the stairs led because suddenly it felt like the most important thing in the world. Like the answer to questions I'd been asking my entire life. But another part of me, the part that had memorized protocols, that had read incident reports, that knew what happened to people who climbed, screamed at me to move, to get down, to retreat. I forced myself to look away from the third step, forced my legs to move, step down to the first step, then to the ground, then backward, 5 meters, 10, 20, and the pressure released. The world snapped back to normal. The compulsion evaporated like it had never existed, and I was left shaking, gasping, realizing how close I'd come to climbing, how powerfully I'd wanted to despite knowing better, despite years of training, despite everything. I retrieved my camera, photographed the symbols from ground level. I packed my equipment, left immediately instead of completing the full inspection, hiked 8 hours straight back to base, radioed Helena the moment I had a signal, and spent the next 3 days debriefing, explaining what I'd felt, how strong the compulsion had been, how much I'd wanted to climb despite knowing the consequences. Helena reviewed my report carefully, then showed me something. "This is the carving," she said, pulling up an image database. "It's appeared before, on 7 other staircases, always during high activation periods. We think they're not carved by people. We think they're manifestations. The threshold trying to open itself, trying to create lures. You felt the compulsion because standing on the second step during an activation event with fresh carvings present creates maximum vulnerability. You were exactly where the threshold needed you to be, 1 step away from completing the opening. If you'd climbed to the third step at that moment, you wouldn't have disappeared. You'd have opened it fully, and whatever is on the other side would have had a clear path through." "What do we do now?" I asked. "You're done with staircase 3, Helena said. "We'll assign it to someone else. You'll continue with your other routes. But 3 is off your list, because now it knows you. Now it's established that you're vulnerable to it, and going back would be dangerous, for you and for everyone else. The protocols exist to prevent personal connections between custodians and specific sites. You're supposed to remain anonymous, detached. But you felt something at staircase 3 that went beyond protocol. It recognized you, and that changes everything.